For many, the counterculture of the 1960s was summed up by the Festival of Music and Protest at Woodstock. But counterculture also reflected a growing number of college students, attracting a new wave of performers connected by new channels of communication. And the leading center of that universe was here in Boston and Cambridge, with ripple effects that have long been underestimated. That's the main point of a new oral history called Counterculture in Boston, 1968 through the 1980s. We'd like to welcome the author who's been covering the story for decades, Charles Giuliano. Thank you very much for being with us, Charles.
Thank you.
I want to take you back to somewhere near the beginning of the story, because the way you experienced it was like things that we dreamed about when we were growing. You went to a lot of concerts. How did you get into doing that?
Free.
Yes.
Yeah. Everything happens by chance. It's hard to explain. My training was in art history, and I kind of, came back from living in New York and running galleries and going to graduate school, and came back and got involved with the Avatar. And there was a big blow up with Mel Lyman, and they actually confiscated and destroyed the issue I put out, issue number 25. And then it seemed to all go south, and then Dave Wilson came in, and Dave and I edited the publication that summer. By the end of the summer, he had had enough and wanted to go back to spending his time exclusively with Broadside, a folk music publication. And I segued into becoming the art director of Boston After Dark, hired by my former Brandeis editor, Arnie Reisman. I really knew nothing about that, what I was doing, and soon the person that assisted me took over, and should have all along. And I stayed on as the art critic, and I had a column called Art Bag, and I became very, very much an activist in the new fine arts scene, which I don't write about in this book because I think it's a subject that deserves its own book.
Well, one of the things your book reminded me, now that...
You actually read it.
Yes, I actually read it, but it reminded me...
From cover to cover.
Pretty much. And one thing I almost forgotten was how subversive or anarchic things were in those times, too.
Can you frame that as a question?
Well, for instance, I mean, talking about some of the... let's say, after Janis Joplin performed at Harvard Stadium, which you described, I think, very carefully, you had all these police who were just ready for all hell to break loose.
They trashed the square.
Yes.
The kids came out of, that concert was so crazy because the equipment was stolen. And so she went on really late. And by the time she went on, she was totally trashed. And there's actually an underground album that I have of that performance. And, so everyone was so frustrated and high energy. And John Sudeikis, who's in the book, talks about he was a stage manager, and she's going up on stage with a bottle in each hand, and he grabbed one of them and said, "Hey, you can't do that." And she kind of ducked around and went on stage with a bottle of bourbon. And that was her last performance. She went from there back to Los Angeles probably and was recording and overdosed. And interestingly enough, her face came down on the counter and her nose broke and went into her brain and killed her. Around that time, I had become the editor, the rock and roll critic at the Boston Herald Traveler Daily, long since morphed into many changes. And less than 6 months on the job, I wrote an obituary for Al Wilson of Canned Heat, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, and then later in the fall, Jimi Hendrix. And so an editor came to me and said, a guy with like short hair, looked like a Marine, "I want you to write an article telling those kids about the dangers of drugs and sex and rock and roll, and you give them a good talking to." And I said, okay. And I went into the morgue of the paper and I pulled out, they have clippings in little folders so drugs, sex, stars, Hollywood. And I dredged up all this stuff and went back to my desk, and I said, "This is nothing new." And I talked about Irwin the Body and Marilyn Monroe, and there was a great quote from Robert Mitchum, who told the judge he was busted for marijuana, and he says, "Yes, Your Honor, I smoke up to 3 marijuana cigarettes per day." And so, I mean, this whole thing about this is a cycle that unfortunately just goes on and on and on. Every generation has it.
And of course, there's a cycle of hysteria because there is this club, the Tea Party in the South
Right.
End, lots of great performers, but a local politician, Dapper O'Neill, a very reactionary fellow, decides to have a drug scare, and I guess that didn't work out. Tell us what happened with that.
Well, actually, Steve Nelson talks about that because he was the first manager of the club. And they were going to turn the club over from top to bottom. They didn't find anything. What they found was an expired license for dispensing Coca-Cola. So they were going to close down the club for unlicensed selling of soda.
Of course, the interesting.
And he was a colorful guy. If you ever knew Dap was.
Oh, I did. Know
Dap
him.
was out there, and I also knew Dick Sinnott, who we used to call
city censor.
The city censor. I ended up knowing all these guys. Ironically, when you knew them one-on-one, they weren't bad people. I mean, they were posturing and they took their positions, but actually they were pretty cool guys.
Well, one thing that it even surprised me looking at your book, all of the artists who either played here
Right.
or got discovered here,
Right.
and so why did they converge? What was it about Boston
Well,
that drew them?
that's the essential point of the book, which is that what's gone unreported. I mean, everyone kind of credits San Francisco, and rightly so, the great San Francisco bands, the Summer of Love and Flower Power, and so the counterculture got invented there. That was '67. In '68, as the Bill Lichtenstein film, WBCN, The American Revolution, documents very accurately, it transferred from San Francisco, this kind of flower power, in 1968 to Boston Common as social activism. So the whole protest against the war and Abbie Hoffman, everything happened here. And why here? Because the demographic was that there's a transient 250,000 college student base that turns over year after year. And so the entrepreneurs kind of, particularly Ray Ripon, who started the Boston Tea Party Rock Club, transformed WBCN from all classical to all rock, and became a partner in the Cambridge Phoenix. And then Ray, oddly enough, folded it all and left town. But these entrepreneurs discovered that there was a huge market. And Boston became important because if you think about it, rock acts tour all over America. And so when the British invasion was happening, we're talking about the early days of The Who and the Yardbirds and Led Zeppelin and Spooky Tooth and those kinds of bands, Fleetwood Mac would come over and over and over again. Boston was a breakout town. Not only Boston, but John Sudeikis, who talks about it in the book, he set up a whole network of New England colleges. I mean, if you take the point of a compass and you go within a 50-mile radius of the city of Boston, how many schools are there? I mean, you've got Worcester and Springfield, and so this became a huge market for rock and roll. And then, of course, WBCN with his album-oriented rock radio, and WBUR. I mean, it started here with Uncle T. So that Boston became the matrix for all that.
And this also goes for album-oriented jazz. When Miles Davis was doing things like Bitches,
Right.
he had to come here to promote that with a concert, right?
Well, I knew Miles. I always like to say that I knew Miles, but he didn't know me. I got to hang out with him, and he was an amazing person to know personally, and that was, talking about then and now, the major difference was that you had access to these people. You don't anymore. I mean, it's all become totally corporate, and these rock stars are now so huge and so big.
Charles, one of the things I didn't expect right away from Counterculture was seeing how much of it was about jazz in Boston.
Right.
Why was Boston so important for jazz?
People have asked me that. I mean, what's George Wayne doing in this book and so on and so forth. I wanted to kind of back end it a little bit. That I grew up in Boston, and the first jazz I ever saw was Storyville, which was in Copley Square. My uncle took me to see Duke Ellington. Interestingly enough, where we sit here, right around the corner was the first Storyville. George Wayne was, at Boston University as an undergraduate. He used to play, cocktail piano and so on and so forth. So it was the Newport Jazz Festival grew out of here. I mean, we're really literally talking about where we sit right at this moment, right here in Kenmore Square. And then he started the clubs, and the Laurelides came in and invited him to found the Newport Jazz Festival. But again, talking historically, it's so great to be a critic in Boston because every major artist came here. And so I saw them all. Coltrane, John Coltrane, Chick Corea was from Chelsea, Keith Jarrett, all these guys, Miles Davis, they all came. They played at the Jazz Workshop in Paul's Mall. And people don't think about the counterculture as being jazz, but in fact it was. Because you can't separate the counterculture from civil rights, integration, all the social and political movements that were going on. And the difference was that the jazz musicians were revolutionary in their music, in the sense of they experimented with form. So there is explicit radical protest jazz. I mean, it's absolutely out there with Abbey Lincoln and artists but it was like you didn't have to protest it for being black. Being black was a protest. So that was an important part of it.
One fascinating backstory, and I think it was just a little before Ellington was going to play at Newport, there was a phone conversation about what the critics were going to expect.
Oh, right.
And I think that led to his sort of historic, that crescendo and diminuendo in blue, with that famous sax solo.
There's a very good book about that event. And, I was a big fan of Duke going back to high school and my uncle. And the Duke was kind of fading in the sense that he was last of the big bands, and bebop was in, and so on and so forth. So George Wein said to him, Duke, you got to do something new when you come to Newport. So he did this thing called the Festival Suite, which is not highly regarded in the canon. It's not one of the major symphonic form pieces that he did, and he did wonderful things like Black, Brown, and Beige, or Liberian Suite, and so on. And then he pulls up an old chestnut. Okay, let's play diminuendo and crescendo and blue. And there's a bridge, and Paul Gonzalez was a kind of quirky guy.
From Brockton too, right?
No, Fall River.
Fall River.
He was Cape Verdean. So he's that Cape Verdean community that he comes from. And he was kind of like, more times than not that I went to see Ellington, he was nodding off on the stand. Duke was very tolerant. I mean, there were a lot of junkies in that band, but he's very tolerant. If he called your number, you got up and did your solo. If you couldn't do your solo, you're out. So, so that particular night, he says, well, we're going to have Paul Gonzalez play diminuendo and crescendo, the bridge. He was on for 23 choruses. People were leaving. They came back. And then there's this very famous story about that there was this woman in the audience. She was a Newport socialite. She got up in the aisle and started dancing, et cetera, et cetera. And then from George Wein's point of view, he pulled the wrong deal. George Avakian of Columbia Records, we're talking early days of LP, decided that Columbia would record the concerts the whole weekend, and that they would pay for it. So the deal was that George Avakian and Columbia recorded that album and everything that was done at Newport that weekend, and Wein got no royalties because he signed off, So he got a free festival, and then of course shot himself in the head because the album went on to make tons and tons of money.
And of course, Boston was also where that Dave Brubeck breakthrough recording was made in the early 1950s. But I want to ask
by Freddie Taylor.
Right.
With his little home speaker, he goes down as he's a jazz kid, and he goes up to the club at Storyville and says, "Dave, can I tape you?" And that became an album.
I want to ask you about the other facet of counterculture, and that was alternative journalism. It started maybe as underground.
Absolutely, so important.
There was one story that really sums up how powerful it was when Tom Winship from the Globe calls one of the alternatives.
Yeah.
Tell the rest of that, please.
Well, just to sketch this, because it's such an important topic that I'd like to give it more than a sentence. I came up through the underground press. Avatar was considered underground press. Interesting enough, here on the BU campus was the epicenter of that. We're talking about Ray Mungo and BU News, and then out of that became Liberation News Service. So there was an ambition at one point there was going to be a national network of underground papers. And they were being subsidized by record companies taking ads. So that all of a sudden there were literally 100 or more underground papers all over America. Columbia put out an ad called "The Man Can't Bust Our Music," and that collapsed all the advertising. The advertising dropped. So there was a transition then from underground to the emergence of the alternative weeklies. Boston After Dark under Steve Mindisch initially was only entertainment. It had no radical political reporting. Eventually, Arnie Reisman convinced Mindisch that, no, you've got to get with the times. We've got to have politics as part of the mix.
If I want to ask you, you're talking in this book to a lot of people you might not have seen for maybe
Correct.
decades.
Right.
What's it like coming back to some of these people, talking to them, and maybe thinking differently?
Well, first of all, there's a commonality of, like, you say, hi, are you alive? I'm alive. How old are you? Are you okay? I mean, how many pills a day do you take? I mean, there was a feeling of urgency about doing this book in the sense that, Ween is in his 90s. Freddie Taylor is in his high 80s, like Ron Delacieser's in his 80s. I mean, all these guys are out there, like I'm going to be 80 in a week or so. So, I mean, there was an urgency about that. So, I mean, a lot of it was just kind of, hi, how you been? And reconnecting. And of course, so many of us are now living very sedate lives compared to what we did. I mean, the days of drug, sex, rock and roll are long behind us. So I mean, it's kind of, and it's interesting when you talk to your peers, you talk about your symptoms and your procedures and your pills and how many a day do you take. And today I take a fistful of drugs every day and I don't get a buzz, So.
That's one way to look at it. Well, for people who want to relive the buzz and rethink it, how do they get this book?
Okay, the book is available through Amazon.com, and I'm currently negotiating with some bookstores, and they can get it from me directly at BerkshireFineArts.com, and I'd be glad to send them an autographed copy,
Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Charles Giuliano.
Thank you.
And the book is Counterculture in Boston, 1968 through the 1980s.